My name is Carolyn Mercer. I'm 41 years old. And the man I spent my entire adult life defending borrowed $40,000 from me to fund a life I never knew existed. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not the money. I'll get to the money. I want you to sit with the word defending. Because that's the part that keeps me up at night, not the wire transfers. Not the fake invoices printed on paper so thin I should have held them up to the light. What haunts me is how many dinner tables I sat at, how many family arguments I inserted myself into, how many times I looked my mother in the eye and said, Dominic is doing his best. He just needs someone in his corner. He just needs one person who believes in him. I was that person. For 22 years, I was that person. And he knew it. He built an entire con around it. The morning I found out, really found out, not suspected, not worried, but knew with the kind of certainty that rearranges your internal organs, I was sitting at my kitchen table in Raleigh, North Carolina, with a cup of coffee I never finished and a manila folder my husband Marcus had set down in front of me without saying a single word. He just placed it there, slid it across the table like he was serving me something he knew I didn't want to eat. And then he sat down across from me and folded his hands and waited. Marcus is a CPA, has been for 16 years. He is the least dramatic person I've ever met in my life. He does not exaggerate. He does not catastrophize. He speaks in figures and facts, and he has the emotional temperature of a man who has seen enough financial devastation in his career that very little shocks him anymore. He was shocked. I opened the folder. There were 11 pages inside: bank records, search results, a screenshot from the North Carolina Secretary of State's business registry, and at the top of the first page, Marcus had written 4 words in his neat accountant's handwriting. It was never registered. Dominic's business, the one I had loaned him $40,000 to save in installments over 18 months because I believed in him, because he was my little brother, because he had sat across from me at this same kitchen table with his eyes red and his voice cracking and told me he was this close to turning it all around. That business did not exist, had never existed. There was no LLC, no EIN, no registered trade name, no vendor accounts, no lease, no employees named Gerald and Tasha who he'd had to let go because cash flow was tight, no quarterly filings, no business bank account in the name of Mercer Property Solutions, which was what he had told me the company was called. There was nothing. 18 months of nothing, dressed up in terminology he'd clearly Googled the night before each phone call. I sat at that table for a long time. The coffee went cold. Marcus didn't move. Outside, our neighbor Mrs. Patterson was walking her little terrier past our front window, the way she does every morning at 7:15. And I remember watching that dog sniff the hedges and thinking, that dog has more of a verifiable existence than my brother's company. I know that sounds like a strange thing to think in a moment like that, but grief makes you strange. And what I felt in that moment, underneath the shock, underneath the humiliation, underneath the hot, slow rising fury, was grief. Because the brother I had loved, the one I had defended and believed in, and quietly, privately cried over because the world just never seemed to give him a fair shot. That brother had never existed either. What existed was a man who had looked at my love and seen a resource. I need to tell you how we got here. I need to go back to the beginning because if I just tell you about the $40,000, you'll think this is a story about money. It isn't. It's a story about what happens when you love someone more carefully than they deserve, when you sand down your own instincts, because the alternative, believing that someone you love is capable of this, feels too devastating to consider. But before I do, I need to ask you something. Before we go back to the beginning, before I show you every moment I should have seen and chose not to, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments right now. Just your city, just a hello. Because I know I'm not the only one who has ever sat at a kitchen table with cold coffee and a folder full of proof of something they didn't want to be true. And it helps knowing you're out there. It helps more than I can say. Now, let me tell you about Dominic. He is 3 years younger than me. He has our father's jaw and our mother's charm and a laugh that has always made every room feel 10 degrees warmer. Growing up in Durham, he was the kid everyone wanted at their birthday party. Teachers liked him, neighbors liked him. Our uncle raised to say Dominic could sell winter coats in July, which the rest of the family said as a compliment for a very long time before any of us understood what it actually meant. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who got a scholarship to NC State and graduated with a degree in healthcare administration and took a job at a hospital system in Raleigh and built a careful, documented, unremarkable life. I did not mind being the quiet one. I had Marcus. I had our house on Birchwood Drive with the garden I'd been trying to grow for 4 years. I had a life I was proud of. And I had Dominic, who always needed just a little more from me than I had planned to give. The first loan was $600. I was 27. He was 24 and between jobs and needed to cover his electric bill. I sent it without blinking. He paid it back in 3 months with a $20 grocery store gift card and a handwritten note that said, "You're the only real one, sis." I kept that note in my desk drawer for years. I should have understood then what kind of story that note was the beginning of. But I didn't, because I loved him. Because loving someone, really loving them, means you don't audit it. You don't keep score. You don't hold the gift card up and calculate the return on your investment. You just love them. You just keep being the one real thing in their corner until the corner turns out to be a trap. The $600 electric bill was 2009. By 2019, I had loaned Dominic, in total, across various emergencies, opportunities, and crises, just under $14,000. I know that number precisely because Marcus, bless him, had kept a quiet record. Not to be cruel, not to hold it over anyone. He kept it the way he keeps everything because he is a man who believes that numbers tell the truth even when people don't. He showed it to me once in 2019 on a yellow legal pad, and I remember looking at it and feeling a complicated shame that I couldn't entirely explain. Not because I regretted helping, but because seeing it written down made it real in a way that each individual moment had it been. $14,000 spread across a decade. A car repair in 2011, rent twice in 2013, during what Dominic called his restructuring period, which meant he had quit a perfectly good logistics job because his manager disrespected him and he needed 60 days to find something better. A medical bill in 2015, his then girlfriend Trina's procedure, which he said he'd handle once he got his tax return and never mentioned again. A security deposit in 2017 for the apartment in Charlotte he moved into after Trina left, which he described as a fresh start, a new chapter, the beginning of something real. Each time, there was a story. Each time, the story was specific enough to feel true and emotional enough to make asking questions feel heartless. And each time I told myself, this is what family does. This is what it means to be someone's person. You show up. You don't calculate. Marcus never told me not to give the money. That's something I want to be clear about because it would be easy to let him look like the villain of this part of the story, and he wasn't. He expressed concern exactly twice, once in 2013 and once in 2017, in his careful, measured way. Both times, I told him that Dominic was family and that I understood him in a way that was hard to explain, but that I was asking Marcus to trust me. Both times, Marcus said okay, and then he updated the yellow legal pad and didn't say another word. That is the man I married. I am still grateful for him every single day. Now, Mercer Property Solutions. Dominic called me on a Thursday evening in February of 2021. I remember it was a Thursday because I had just gotten home from a 10-hour shift. We were still navigating the tail end of the pandemic backlog at the hospital, and I was exhausted in a way that lived in my bones. I had my shoes off and my feet up, and Marcus was making pasta in the kitchen. And I almost didn't answer. I almost let it go to voicemail. I have thought about that moment, the phone buzzing on the coffee table, Dominic's name on the screen, my hand reaching for it, more times than I can count. I answered. His voice was different that night, not the warm, room filling voice I grew up with. This was quieter, tighter. The voice of a man performing distress rather than feeling it, though I would not understand that distinction until much later. He told me he had started a property management consulting business 18 months earlier. He had clients. He had staff, two people, Gerald and Tasha, both part-time. He had, he said, a real thing going, something finally real. But cash flow, he explained. Cash flow was the monster under every small business's bed. He had invoices outstanding, three of them totaling nearly $60,000 from property management firms that were slow to pay. And while he waited on those invoices, he couldn't make payroll, couldn't cover his operating costs, couldn't keep Gerald and Tasha, who both had families, who were both counting on him. He said that last part twice, that they were counting on him. He had done his research, he told me. He knew exactly what he needed to bridge the gap, $20,000, just to get through the next 90 days until the invoices cleared. And then he would pay me back with interest, he said. He actually used the word interest. He said he would pay me back 8% above principal because he was not asking for charity. He was asking for a bridge loan from the only person in the world he trusted completely. I felt it then. That pull. That specific gravitational force that only exists between people who have loved each other their whole lives. The part of me that remembered him at 7 years old, sitting on the edge of my bed when he had a nightmare, not wanting to wake our parents. The part of me that had always been his safe place and had never once questioned whether being his safe place was safe for me. I told him I needed to talk to Marcus. I did talk to Marcus. We sat at the kitchen table, that same table, always that table, and I laid out what Dominic had told me. And Marcus asked 3 questions. He asked, "Has Dominic shown you anything in writing about the business?" I said no, but I hadn't asked. Marcus asked, "Do you know the name of the business?" I said yes, Mercer Property Solutions. And then Marcus asked his third question. The one I now understand was the most important one. The one I should have chased all the way to the ground instead of skating past. "Do you know if it's registered?" I said I assumed so. I said Dominic had mentioned clients and staff and invoices, so I assumed the business infrastructure was there. And Marcus looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Okay, if you want to help him. But ask to see something on paper first." I called Dominic the next morning and asked, as gently as I could, if he could send me something, anything, with the business name on it, an invoice template, a business card, anything. He sent me a PDF within 20 minutes. It had a logo, a simple navy blue graphic with the letters MPS and his name and phone number and the business name in clean sans serif font. It looked, to me, entirely professional. I sent it to Marcus, who glanced at it and said it looked like a Canva template, but that it wasn't nothing. It was nothing. I know that now. A logo is not a business, a PDF is not a company. But I was looking for a reason to say yes, and he gave me one. And I sent him $10,000 that afternoon and 10,000 more 6 weeks later when he called back and said the invoices were still pending and Gerald was threatening to quit. The second 10,000 came faster than the first because by then I had already invested. Because by then, in my mind, the only way the first 10,000 made sense was if the business was real and I was the person who believed in it when no one else would. I could not afford, emotionally, for it not to be real. That is the mechanism. That is how it works. And I am not embarrassed to explain it because I think a lot of people sitting where you are right now have felt exactly that pull. That moment where you've already given enough that walking away feels like admitting you were foolish, so instead you give more to prove to yourself that you weren't. Over the next 14 months, I sent Dominic money 7 more times. 1,000 here, 3,500 there. Once, 8,000 in a single transfer because he called me crying, actually crying, and said he was about to lose everything, that Gerald and Tasha were gone and he was the only one left and he just needed one more bridge, one more month. The total, when Marcus finally added it up, was $40,250. And then Marcus sat down with his coffee one Saturday morning in June of 2023 and decided, not because anything dramatic had happened, but simply because he was a man who periodically checked on things, to look up Mercer Property Solutions in the North Carolina Secretary of State's Business Registry. It wasn't there. He searched 3 different ways. He searched Dominic's full name. He searched every variation of the business name. He searched the address Dominic had listed on the PDF. He found nothing. Not a dissolved LLC. Not a revoked registration. Not a suspended entity. Nothing. The business had never been filed. Had never, in any legal or administrative sense, existed at all. He didn't wake me up. He didn't call me into the room. He simply pulled 11 pages of documentation, put them in a manila folder, and waited until Sunday morning when I came downstairs for coffee. And then he slid the folder across the table. And my brother, the one with the warm laugh, the one who could sell winter coats in July, the one I had defended at every dinner table for 22 years, disappeared. Not physically. He was still out there somewhere, living whatever life my $40,000 had helped him build. But the brother I had loved, the one I had believed in with my whole chest, he had never existed either. I did not call Dominic that Sunday. I know that might surprise you. I think most people, when they imagine discovering something like this, picture themselves reaching for the phone immediately, hands shaking, voice cracking. The confrontation happening in real time, raw and unfiltered, before the shock has even finished moving through your body. I understand that impulse. I have a temper. I come from a family where feelings were expressed at full volume around a kitchen table with people talking over each other, and if you'd asked me 6 months earlier how I would react to being betrayed like this, I would have told you I'd probably say things I couldn't take back. But I didn't call him. I closed the folder. I finished my coffee. I told Marcus I needed a few days to think, and he nodded and refilled my cup and did not push me once. I went to church that Sunday with a face I had arranged very carefully, and I sat in the third pew where my family has always sat, and I sang the hymns I've known since I was 7 years old, and I held myself together with both hands. I needed to be sure before I moved, not emotionally sure. I was already certain in the place where certainty lives before your mind catches up. I mean, strategically sure. I had given $40,000 to a man whose business did not exist, and if I called him in a rage, I would hand him the advantage. He would cry. He would explain. He would produce some new story so specific and so emotionally calibrated that I would find myself in the same position I'd been in for 18 months, looking for a reason to believe him because I couldn't bear the alternative. I was not going to give him that chance again, so I waited 3 days. And on Wednesday evening, after Marcus had gone to bed, I called my best friend Renata, who has known me since we were 14 years old and who is one of the only people on earth I trust with the unedited version of myself. I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine off and told her everything: the business registry, the folder, the 7 years of smaller loans before that, all of it. Renata was quiet for a long time when I finished. She is not a quiet person by nature. That silence was its own kind of answer. Then she said, "Carolyn, how long have you known?" And I understood exactly what she meant. Not how long since Marcus showed me the folder. She meant how long had some part of me sensed that something was wrong and chosen, very deliberately, not to look directly at it. I thought about the Canva logo. I thought about the fact that in 18 months, Dominic had never once suggested I speak with Gerald or Tasha, had never mentioned a client by name, had never invited me to an office, even casually, even virtually, had always had a reason why the timing wasn't right, why things were in flux, why once everything settled, he'd walk me through the whole operation and I'd see what he was building. I told Renata, probably longer than I want to admit. She told me to talk to a lawyer before I did anything else, not a family friend, a real attorney. She gave me the name of a woman she knew, Diane Okafor, civil litigation, downtown Raleigh, and told me to call her in the morning. I called Diane at 8 a.m. on Thursday. I had an appointment by noon. But first, I called Dominic. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't to warn him. It wasn't sentimentality. I called him because I needed to hear his voice one more time while I still had the option of being wrong, because 41 years of being someone's sister doesn't dissolve in 3 days, even when it probably should. I called him the way you press on a bruise, not because it feels good, but because some part of you needs to confirm it still hurts. He answered on the second ring. "Carolyn." "Hey, what's going on?" His voice was warm. Easy. Exactly what it always was. And something in my chest moved in a way I didn't expect. Not softened, but sharpened, because he sounded so completely normal, so entirely unbothered. And I realized, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that this was not a man who was bracing for a conversation. This was a man who believed he was perfectly safe. I kept my voice level. I told him I had been thinking about the business and wanted to check in. I asked how things were going. He said things were picking up, said he had a new client, a property management group out of Greensboro, bigger than anyone he'd worked with before. Said he thought this was going to be the thing that turned the corner. He used the phrase, turned the corner. I'd heard him use it so many times that it had stopped meaning anything years ago. Like a word you say so often, it becomes just a sound. I said, "Dominic, what's your EIN?" Silence. Not long silence. Maybe 4 seconds. But 4 seconds is an eternity when you are listening for a lie. And when he came back, his voice had shifted. Barely. Just a fraction, like a picture frame that's slightly off the wall. And he said, "Why are you asking me that?" I said, because I want to look the business up, because I want to see it in the registry and feel good about everything we've been doing together. Another pause. Then, Carolyn, the business is going through a restructuring right now in terms of how it's filed. It's a whole thing with my accountant. It's temporary. Restructuring. That word again. The same word he'd used in 2013 when he quit his job. He had a library of words like that, words that sounded like explanations but contained no actual information. I said, I already looked, Dominic. There's nothing there. The silence that followed was a different kind, fuller, heavier. The silence of a man who has just felt the ground shift under his feet. Then he said, and I will remember this until I die. It's more complicated than what shows up in a search. And something in me went completely still. Not angry, not sad, just still. The way a room goes still after a door closes. I said, I need you to come to Raleigh this weekend. We need to sit down together. He said he'd see if he could make it work. I said, it's not optional, Dominic. He came on Saturday. He sat across from me at that kitchen table, Marcus in the next room, close enough to hear, and for 2 hours I watched my brother try to build a story out of collapsing materials. He said the business had been real, but that the filing had lapsed. He said there had been a fire at the property where he rented office space. I later confirmed no such fire had occurred. He said Gerald and Tasha were independent contractors and therefore didn't show up the way employees would. He said the clients were all verbal agreements, relationship based, the way small businesses worked in his industry. He said at one point, looking me dead in the eye, I have always intended to pay you back, Carolyn. That has never changed. I let him finish. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice once. And when he was done, when he had laid out every piece of the story he had left, I opened the folder Marcus had put together, now thicker with additional documentation Diane had advised me to gather, and I set it on the table between us. I said, I've spoken with a civil litigation attorney. I have records of every transfer. I have your messages asking for each one. I have the registry search. I have the address you listed, which is a UPS store. And I'm going to give you 72 hours to decide how you want to handle this before she files. Dominic looked at the folder. He looked at me. And for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, I saw something move across his face that wasn't calculation or performance. I think it was the look of a man who had genuinely not believed this moment would come, who had trusted, in some fundamental way, that I would never stop being the person who gave him the benefit of the doubt. He said, You'd really do this? To your own brother? I said, You did this to your own sister. I stood up. I told him he could see himself out. And I walked to the kitchen where Marcus was standing at the counter with his arms folded and his eyes steady, and I leaned against him and I did not cry. Not yet. That would come later, privately, in the kind of grief that doesn't need an audience. But in that moment, I just stood there and breathed. And I began to plan. The 72 hours came and went. Dominic did not call, did not text, did not show up at my door with a cashier's check and a genuine apology, which was the only version of that scenario I might have considered. What he did, I learned later from my mother, was drive back to Charlotte, spend 2 days at his apartment, and then call her, our mother, Elaine, 67 years old, retired school teacher, woman who had raised us both to understand that family was the only thing in this world you could count on, and tell her that I was trying to destroy him. That was the word he used, destroy. I found this out on a Tuesday morning when my mother called me, and the first thing she said was not hello. The first thing she said was, Carolyn, what is going on with you and your brother? I want to pause here and tell you something about Elaine Mercer, because she matters to this story more than she might seem to at first. My mother is not a foolish woman. She raised 2 children largely on her own after my father's health declined in the late 90s. She worked 31 years in the Durham public school system. She is sharp and pragmatic and has a finely tuned antenna for nonsense that she has deployed effectively her entire life. But she has one blind spot, one place where that antenna goes completely quiet, and that blind spot has always been Dominic. Not because she loves him more than me. I want to be careful here because this is the part of the story where it would be easy to make her a villain, and she is not. She loves us both. But Dominic has always known how to present himself to her in a way that activates something maternal and protective that bypasses her judgment. He was the younger one, the one who struggled, the one who always seemed to be one good break away from everything coming together. And my mother, like me, if I'm being honest, had spent decades being that one good break. So when she called me that Tuesday and asked what was going on, there was already something in her voice, a guardedness, a leaning toward his version before she'd even heard mine. I told her calmly and completely. I told her about Mercer Property Solutions and the registry search. I told her about the folder. I told her the total amount. I told her about sitting across from him at my kitchen table and watching him build a fiction out of nothing while I kept my hands flat and my voice even. I told her about the 72 hours and the silence that followed. When I finished, my mother was quiet. Then she said, $40,000, Carolyn. I said, yes, ma'am. She said, why didn't you tell me it had gotten that far? And that question, not I can't believe you did this or we're going to make this right, but why didn't you tell me? Told me almost everything I needed to know about how this next chapter was going to go. She wasn't angry at Dominic. She was overwhelmed by the number and looking, instinctively, for a way to reframe it that didn't require her to see her son clearly. I told her I hadn't said anything because I hadn't wanted to worry her, which was true, and also because some part of me had always believed, right up until the folder, that Dominic would turn the corner, that one more month, one more bridge, and the thing he was building would finally become real, and the loans would become an investment, and the story would have a different ending. We talked for 40 minutes. My mother did not tell me I was wrong to pursue this, but she asked me twice whether there was a way to handle it privately, whether I had considered giving him a payment plan, whether going to a lawyer was really necessary when we could sit down as a family. I said, Mama, we did sit down as a family. He lied to my face for 2 hours. She didn't have an answer for that, but I could hear in the silence that it hadn't landed the way I needed it to, that she was going to grieve this in her own way, and that her grief was going to look, at least for a while, uncomfortably like grace extended in the wrong direction. I said goodbye. I held the phone in my hand for a moment after we hung up, and then I called Diane Okafor and told her to move forward. Here's what moving forward looked like, practically, because I think this part matters. I think the people watching this who have been in similar situations need to understand that there is a real, legal, methodical process available to you, and it is far more powerful than any argument you could have at a kitchen table. Diane filed a civil claim for fraudulent misrepresentation and unjust enrichment. These are not small accusations. Fraudulent misrepresentation means that someone knowingly made false statements to induce you to give them something of value. Unjust enrichment means they benefited from those false statements at your expense. Together, they formed the legal architecture of exactly what Dominic had done. The documentation was, thanks to Marcus, nearly airtight. We had records of every single wire transfer, dates, amounts, and the account they'd gone to. We had 17 text messages in which Dominic had referenced the business, described its operations, mentioned Gerald and Tasha by name, and provided updates on the fictional outstanding invoices. We had the PDF logo he had sent me, which Diane noted was consistent with a free Canva template traceable to a public design platform. We had the Secretary of State registry showing no filing ever under any variation of the business name. We had the UPS store address he had listed on the PDF, confirmed by a simple Google Map search. And we had, perhaps most critically, a voicemail. I had forgotten about the voicemail until I went back through my phone at Diane's instruction and searched for anything with Dominic's voice on it. It was from March of 2022, 14 months into the loan period. I had saved it without thinking about why. I think on some level, I save things the way Marcus documents things, as an instinct rather than a plan. In the voicemail, Dominic's voice was warm and relieved. He said the March payment had come through, that he had been able to cover Gerald's hours, that the Greensboro client was progressing, and he thought by summer they would be in a completely different position. He said, and I had to listen to this twice to be sure I was hearing it correctly, Carolyn, I want you to know that what you've done for this business is the reason it's still standing. The business that was never standing, because it never existed. Diane said the voicemail alone would have been sufficient to establish knowing misrepresentation. Combined with everything else, she told me we had one of the cleaner fraud cases she had worked with in recent years. Not because the amount was extraordinary, but because the documentation was so thorough. She said, and I wrote this down because it struck me, most people in your situation have the receipts, but not the context. You have both. Marcus. 16 years of being married to a CPA. I have never been more grateful for anything in my life. Now, while Diane was building the legal case, something else was happening quietly in the background. Dominic, apparently believing that the best defense was a preemptive campaign, had begun talking to our mother, to our Aunt Beverly, to two cousins on our father's side who I have never been particularly close to. The story he was telling, as best as I could reconstruct from the fragments that reached me, was that the business had been real but had failed, that I knew the risks when I lent the money, that calling it fraud was a betrayal of family loyalty, and that I was doing this because Marcus had always looked down on him and had finally found a way to push me to cut him off. Marcus, who had sat at that table and said, "If you want to help him, help him." I did not respond to any of it. This is the part that required the most discipline because I am not by nature a woman who absorbs accusations quietly. But Diane had been clear: say nothing publicly, say nothing to family members who might relay it back to him, document anything that came to me, and let the process do what the process was designed to do. So I went to work, I came home, I had dinner with Marcus, I tended to my garden, which that summer produced more tomatoes than I knew what to do with. I went to church on Sundays and I answered my mother's calls, and I said very little and I let the legal machinery move at its own pace. Dominic was served on a Thursday in late August. Diane told me he had signed for it himself. He called me 4 times that evening. I did not answer. He left one voicemail, shorter than the one he'd left in March 2022, and nothing like it in tone. This one was not warm. It was tight and clipped and held together with something that sounded underneath the indignation very much like fear. He said, "Carolyn, this is not what family does. I need you to call me back." I saved it to the same folder as everything else. And then I sat in my garden in the late August heat with a glass of iced tea and I watched the tomatoes and I breathed and I thought about the yellow legal pad Marcus had shown me in 2019 with $14,000 on it and how I had looked at it and felt complicated shame. I did not feel shame anymore. What I felt sitting in that garden was something I had not felt in a very long time when it came to Dominic. I felt clear. The civil hearing was scheduled for the second week of November. I want to tell you what the weeks leading up to it felt like because I think this part of the story gets left out when people talk about pursuing justice. Everyone wants the courtroom moment, the gavel, the verdict. What they don't talk about is the 6 weeks before it when you are walking around with a case number and a court date and a family that is quietly fractured along fault lines you didn't choose and can't fully control. My mother came to Raleigh in late September. She drove herself, which she rarely does anymore, which told me how much the visit had cost her in terms of preparation and intention. She sat at my kitchen table. Everyone always ends up at that table, and she had brought a sweet potato pie, which is the Mercer family's way of saying something that words haven't organized themselves around yet. She set it on the counter and sat down and folded her hands the way she does when she is about to say something she has rehearsed. She said, "I'm not here to change your mind." I said, "Okay." She said, "I just need you to know that I believe you. I want you to hear me say that clearly. I believe you, Carolyn." I had not realized how much I needed to hear that until it was in the room with me. I felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight since that Tuesday phone call in August. I didn't cry. I was saving that, but I reached across the table and held both her hands, and we sat there for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "I don't know who my son is." And that sentence, 7 words, said quietly by a 67-year-old woman who had given her life to raising him, was the saddest thing I heard through this entire experience. Sadder than the folder, sadder than the voicemail, sadder than the 4 missed calls on the night he was served. Because my mother had loved Dominic without calculation, the same way I had, and she was sitting across from me now, holding the same grief, the grief of a person who has to revise completely and permanently their understanding of someone they thought they knew. We ate sweet potato pie and we talked about other things for a while, the way families do when the real conversation has already happened and needs time to settle. Before she left, she hugged me at the door and said, "Let me know how it goes." She did not say she was coming to the hearing. She did not say she was on my side, but she had driven 2 hours to sit at my table and tell me she believed me, and I understood that as the most she could give right now, and I chose to receive it as enough. Dominic arrived at the hearing with an attorney, a young man who looked underprepared and slightly uncomfortable, which Diane had predicted. She had told me that people who commit fraud without ever believing they'll be held accountable rarely invest adequately in their legal defense. They believe, right up until the last moment, that something will intervene, that the relationship will soften the outcome, that being family will count for something in a room governed by documentation. It doesn't. That is the thing about civil court that I did not fully understand until I sat in it. It is not interested in your history. It is not moved by Christmas memories or the fact that you used to check on each other during thunderstorms as children. It looks at what was said, what was transferred, what was documented, and what can be proven. And in that room, on that November morning, what could be proven was thorough and clean and entirely on my side. Diane presented the case methodically, the transfers, the text messages, the voicemail from March 2022, which was played in that room, Dominic's warm, easy voice filling the space between us. What you've done for this business is the reason it's still standing. The registry search, the UPS store address, the complete absence of any business infrastructure across 18 months of claimed operation. Dominic's attorney argued that the money had been a series of personal loans between siblings, not investments in a represented business entity, and that the absence of registration didn't constitute fraud if there had been genuine intent to formalize the business. It was the best argument available to him, which tells you something about the quality of what he had to work with. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who had heard most things twice, asked Dominic's attorney one question. She said, "Can you provide any documentation that a business entity existed in any form during the period in question, filed or otherwise, that would support your client's representations to the plaintiff?" The attorney said he could not. She looked at him for a moment over her glasses, then she looked at her notes. Then she ruled, fraudulent misrepresentation established, unjust enrichment established. Dominic was ordered to repay the full $40,250, plus Diane's legal fees, plus court costs. Because he had no savings, something his own financial disclosures made plain, the judge authorized wage garnishment. Every paycheck, a portion would come to me automatically, regardless of whether Dominic cooperated or communicated or acknowledged what he had done. He would not be able to quit his way out of it. He would not be able to restructure his way around it. It would follow him, documented and automated for as long as it took. I sat very still when she read the ruling. Diane touched my arm briefly. I nodded. I did not look at Dominic. I had made that decision beforehand, that I would not watch his face when the judgment came down. Not out of cruelty, not to deny myself the satisfaction people imagine you must feel in that moment, but because I had already spent 22 years watching Dominic's face and calibrating my responses to what I found there. I was done doing that. The ruling existed independent of his reaction to it, and his reaction was no longer information I needed. I looked at the judge, I looked at Diane, and then I looked at my own hands, folded in my lap, and I thought, this is what it looks like when you stop giving someone the benefit of the doubt they stopped deserving years ago. Outside the courthouse, in the pale November light, Diane shook my hand and said I had been the most composed client she had worked with in a case this personal. I thanked her. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and I finally let myself cry. Not from sadness exactly, but from the accumulated weight of everything the last 18 months had required me to hold without putting down. The composure, the strategy. The family phone calls answered with measured voices. The garden tended in the August heat while I waited for a process that moved on its own schedule. All of it came out in that parking lot, quietly, privately, with no audience. The way the real things always do. That was 7 months ago now. The wage garnishment began in December. The payments arrived like clockwork, every 2 weeks, processed automatically, indifferent to feeling. I have not spoken to Dominic since the kitchen table in August, when he looked at me and asked if I would really do this to my own brother. I have not answered his calls, and after December, he stopped making them. My mother and I talk every Sunday. We do not talk about Dominic. We talk about her garden and my garden and Marcus's work in a trip she's thinking about taking to see an old friend in Atlanta. There's a shape missing from those conversations, and we both know it, and we have chosen, by unspoken agreement, to let the shape be there without naming it every week. She is grieving something I am also grieving, just from different angles. I think that is enough common ground to stand on while we figure out the rest. Renata came to Raleigh in January, and we sat in my kitchen and drank wine, and she let me talk until there was nothing left to say. And then she said, "You know what I keep thinking about? That note he sent you. The $20 gift card and the note." I knew exactly which one she meant. "You're the only real one, sis." I told her I had thrown it away, which was true. I threw it away the week after the hearing. Not dramatically. I just took it out of the desk drawer where it had lived for over a decade and put it in the recycling bin on a Tuesday morning before work, the same way you discard anything that has simply outlived its usefulness. Some people have asked me, in the way people ask when they want to know if you have regrets without using the word regrets, whether I would have done anything differently. I have thought about this seriously, the way it deserves. And here is what I've arrived at: I would not have given less love. I don't think love given sincerely is ever the mistake, even when it's given to someone who treats it as a resource. The love was real, the love was mine. It said something true about who I am, and I am not interested in revising myself out of it. What I would have done differently is listen to the questions Marcus asked in 2021 and follow them all the way to the ground, even when following them felt disloyal. Is the business registered? That was the question. And I skated past it because I was looking for a reason to believe rather than a reason to look clearly. That is the thing I am working on now, learning to understand that looking clearly at someone is not a betrayal of love. It is, in fact, the most honest form of it. Because love that cannot withstand scrutiny is not love you were given, it is love you were sold. And I have spent enough of my life and enough of my savings buying things that were never real. If you are sitting where I was sitting, across from someone whose story doesn't quite add up, feeling the pull of history and loyalty and the sunk cost of everything you've already given, I want to say this directly to you. Ask the question. Ask the one question you have been avoiding because the answer might change everything. Write the number down on a yellow legal pad and look at it in daylight. Call the friend who will tell you the truth. Make the appointment with the attorney. Not because the people who love you are always lying, but because the ones who are lying are counting on your love to keep you from looking. Don't let them. My name is Carolyn Mercer. I am 41 years old, and I am, for the first time in a very long time, the only person in charge of what I choose to believe.